The Chicago Cubs weren't the favorites to win the NL Central Division entering the 2023 season. I don't think most assumed they'd suck or anything, but the Cardinals just won the division in 2022, the Brewers were probably going to be in the mix, and the Pirates suddenly had some high hopes. 6 months later, and it's looked pretty different than what most assumed it'd look like. The Cardinals finished in last place. The Pirates, although jumping on those high hopes with a hot April, fell off and ended up being in 4th place. The Cincinnati Reds, who I didn't even mention, ended up being one of the more exciting teams this summer with the addition of some of their young top prospects. So that leaves us with 2 more teams, the Brewers and the Cubs. The Brewers didn't blow anyone away this year. No MVP candidates, no Cy Young candidates, no crazy firepower, nothing like that. But they were just simply a good team. As for the Cubs, they were in it much more than originally expected, becoming a legit contender. But really quick, this is Shane Livensparger. Shane Livensparger is the umpire who ejected the beloved Joey Votto in potentially his final game ever, whether it's with the Reds or in baseball in general. Shane Livensparger isn't subscribed to this channel. Do you really want to be like Shane Livensparger? Consider subscribing if you enjoy the content and haven't yet. Thank you. Cody Bellinger was a godsend to this 2023 Cubs team. A revamped Cody Bellinger, I should say. After being hurt and unproductive for the last 2 seasons, Bellinger found his swing and got his groove back in Chicago. He hit over 300 with an OPS near 900, smacked over 25 home runs, drove in almost 100 runs, clearly the best hitter on the team and one of the best hitters in the National League. Ian Happ played almost every game and was good. Seiya Suzuki was good too. Christopher Morel and Patrick Wisdom are strong hitters, although they didn't play as many games. I've gotten some hate this year for saying that Dansby Swanson isn't that good despite him literally not being that good. Swanson is the shortstop the Cubs decided to sign this past offseason, and he didn't necessarily have a bad year, but he didn't have that good of a year, and he most certainly didn't have a year worth the money he's making on his contract. His defense may be great, but his OPS plus on the year was under 100, meaning he was a below average hitter this year. As for the pitching, Marcus Stroman was great to start off his season, pitching to a 2.47 ERA in his first 102 innings over 17 starts, but then he had to be on the injured list for a while, and when he did pitch, he wasn't as good. Kyle Hendricks was pretty good. Justin Steele was the star of this Cubs rotation, throwing over 170 innings and becoming a Cy Young contender. The bullpen was alright overall. I mean, this Cubs team was relatively similar to how the Brewers were. Not too many stars or anything, although they did have Bellinger, but they were still a good team, good enough to be in the running for the postseason on the last weekend of the regular season, with the Brewers of course just being much more efficient and successful with what they had. But that's not to say the Cubs didn't have a damn good chance to not just make the postseason, but they were even a team that had the upper hand against most of the other National League teams shooting for the wild card spots remaining. The first half of the Cubs season was nothing too special. They were a 500 team in April, had a terrible May, a good June, a good July, but August was really where the Cubs started to make themselves known as a true playoff contender that would not make the front office regret not selling at the trade deadline. They went God mode in August, going 18-9, turning a 5-game deficit behind the first place Brewers into a 3-game deficit, eventually getting as close as 1.5 games back of the Brewers in early September, September 6th, getting themselves to a point where even if they didn't win the division, the Cubs were in a great position to get to the playoffs. It was becoming more and more of a reality every day. On September 6th, the day they got to just 1.5 games back, the Cubs also had a 92% chance to make the postseason according to the site Fangraphs. Now, for obvious reasons, probability is not the end-all be-all. Numbers, statistics, and the probability of something happening doesn't factor in unexpected things that can happen, like teams collapsing, which is exactly what would happen with the Cubs. Unfortunately, despite being on a roll and boosting their playoff hopes to 92%, the Cubs would immediately lose 3 in a row at home to the Diamondbacks before salvaging the final game to avoid getting swept. They'd beat the Rockies in the first game of their road trip, only to then lose the next 2 games before going to Arizona to play the D-backs again and got swept this time. They've lost 8 of 10 at this point, and they're obviously still in the wild card race, but they're also making things easier for the Marlins and the Reds, who are chasing them down. So if the Cubs were going to get back in the playoffs, it was time to whoop some ass. And they did, at least for one game, beating the Pirates 14-1 back at Wrigley Field, only to then lose the next 2 games to a Pirates team that was and had already been out of the playoff race. Up next, the Rockies again, and they took care of business this time around, sweeping them at Wrigley, setting themselves up to control their own destinies for the final week of the season. With that said, things were not going to be easy, as they'd have to travel to Atlanta and play the juggernaut Braves before playing the first place Brewers in the final weekend. But that can't be an excuse. The Cubs had chances to put themselves into an even better situation earlier, but lost too many games to teams they had better records than, so this was it. And in the first game against the Braves, things actually looked promising. The Cubs were at one point up 6-0 with their ace, Justin Steele, on the mound. But at the end of the day, none of that means anything to the Braves, who'd chip away and get within one run by the eighth, and what was about to happen ended up being the beginning of the end for the Cubs. There's 2 outs in the inning with 2 runners on. The Cubs are still up 6-5 with Sean Murphy at the plate for the Braves trying to drive those runners home, and the pitcher on the mound, Drew Smyly, would get exactly what he and the Cubs needed, a harmless pop-up to right field that should have ended the inning. But instead, the Braves would win it, striking out Dansby Swanson, ironically, for the final out. Tough one for the Cubs, and things only got tougher. The Cubs took another lead late into the game, up 3-1 this time, before the Braves eventually tied things up. In the top of the ninth, though, they'd retake the lead, not just 3 outs away from a win. Marcell Ozuna had something to say about that, swinging at a 3-0 pitch and lifting it out to tie the game. The Cubs retook the lead in the 10th. Acuna then tied it with a base hit, stole his 70th base to break baseball history and become the first ever 40 home run, 70 stolen base player. The Cubs announcers got pissed at the Braves for making a big deal out of it, and then Ozzie Albies smacked a walk-off single. Another Cubs loss. The Braves pretty much had Game 3 the whole way, sweeping the Cubs and sending them packing to Milwaukee, now a half game back of the Marlins and completely out of a spot. At this point, in order to make it, they need to at least win their series in Milwaukee and have Miami lose theirs in Pittsburgh. The opposite happened. Carlos Santana would walk off the Brewers in extras, and after being shut down offensively by the Pirates for 7 innings and down 3-0, the Marlins would score 4 in the 8th and win 4-3. So going from a 92% chance to make the postseason to now having their backs completely against the wall, even if they win these next 2 games against the Brewers, they'd have to pray the Marlins lose the next 2. The Cubs no longer controlled their destiny, and it ended up being the death of their season, because despite coming out on top in Milwaukee on Saturday, the Marlins won their game, effectively ending the Cubs season. I guess you could look at this Cubs season a couple different ways. You can go the, hey, they made it farther than expected route, or the we had a playoff spot in the bag and blew it route. And to be honest, I'm gonna go more with that one, the latter. They very clearly could and should have made it, literally having a 92% chance to do so, yet will now be sitting at home or on vacation in October. Whose fault is it? Well, I'd say it was a collective team effort, especially during the last week. I'd also say that this team in general just wasn't good enough, and proved that over the last week. You could have said the same thing about the Marlins, but they ended up proving that notion wrong by squeaking in, something the Cubs failed to do. I wouldn't necessarily say they're doomed from here on out. They have potential to be a good team next year and beyond, but they very well may also be losing some players this offseason, like Cody Bellinger and Marcus Stroman, so the front office has some work to do. And with that, a promising second half for the Chicago Cubs ends on an incredibly disappointing note. Let me know what you think. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.